the royal guard who was tasked with escorting a minister who had been politically replaced without being informed. I have told this story at 3 funerals, 2 retirement parties, 1 wedding where the groom specifically requested it, and approximately 47 times in various pubs across Westminster, Pimlico, and once, memorably, a service station off the M4 where I had stopped for petrol and somehow ended up talking to a lorry driver named Keith for 2 hours. Keith wept. I'm not exaggerating. Keith wept. I tell you this not to boast, but to establish that what follows is a true story, a complete story, and a story that has survived 47 retellings without losing a single essential detail, because the details are the kind that do not leave you. They set up residence. They pay no rent. They are there when you wake up at 3 in the morning and for no reason at all you think, Patterson, that nod, and then you cannot sleep. My name is Holloway. I was, at the time of these events, 26 years old, 11 months into my first posting as a junior civil servant at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media, and Sport, and I was so new to Whitehall that I still found the carpets impressive. Red carpets, everywhere. I had grown up in Doncaster. We did not have red carpets in Doncaster. We had lino. The date was a Thursday in November. I know it was a Thursday because the canteen did a decent shepherd's pie on Thursdays, and I remember being annoyed that the meeting I was about to attend was going to make me miss it. I was, as I say, 26. Priorities were different. The meeting was not supposed to include me. I was supposed to be delivering a briefing document to the 3rd floor and returning to my desk. But the woman I was delivering it to, a senior policy advisor named Caroline Fitch, who had the specific energy of someone who had not slept since 2009 and had made peace with that, looked at me when I handed her the document and said, "Stay. Close the door." I closed the door. What I heard in the next 14 minutes I am not going to repeat in full, because some of it remains, technically, sensitive, and because the specifics are not the point. The point is this. By the time I left that room, I knew that the man who had been Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media, and Sport since the previous autumn, a man named Gerald Grantham, whom I had seen in the corridor perhaps a dozen times, and who had never once acknowledged my existence, which was entirely appropriate given the difference in our stations, was no longer the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media, and Sport. He had been replaced. The decision had come from above. The paperwork was signed. The new man, whose name I will not use here, not out of loyalty but out of irrelevance, was already in a room on the 4th floor being briefed by people considerably more senior than Caroline Fitch. Gerald Grantham did not yet know. This is the part where I have to explain something about how these things work, or rather how they do not work, because people always ask, how does a man not know he's been sacked? And the answer is that it is not like being sacked from Tesco. There is no tap on the shoulder. There is no envelope. There is a process. There are conversations that have to happen in a particular order, with particular people, in particular rooms. And until those conversations happen in that order, the outgoing minister continues to exist in a kind of administrative quantum state, officially replaced, unofficially still in post, the paperwork real and the reality not yet delivered. Grantham's conversation had not yet happened. It was scheduled for 4 o'clock. It was currently 2:47. And at 2:45, I know this because I checked my watch in the lift, the way you do when your brain is processing something too large for it and needs something small and concrete to hold on to. At 2:45, a royal guard named Patterson had been given his assignment for the afternoon. Escort the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media, and Sport from his 3rd floor office to the ministerial car at the Whitehall entrance, and from the car to the reception at Lancaster House, where the Secretary of State was due to represent the department at a cultural funding ceremony. A routine assignment. Patterson had done it before. Different ministers, same choreography. You collect, you escort, you deliver, you stand post. The minister is the minister. Your job is to be exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to do, with exactly the expression you are supposed to have, which is no expression at all. Patterson was very good at his job. I came out of the lift on the 3rd floor at 2:51 and saw him immediately. He was standing outside Grantham's office, perfectly still, shoulders back, eyes forward. In full ceremonial dress, the bearskin was not present. This was not a bearskin occasion, but everything else was. The red tunic, the polished buttons, the bearing that makes you feel when you walk past a man like Patterson that you are the one out of place in the building, not him. He was perhaps 32, dark eyes, a jaw that could have been used to demonstrate the concept of a jaw to someone who had never seen one. He had the particular stillness of a man who has trained his body to understand that movement, unless ordered, is a kind of failure. I knew, standing in that corridor at 2:51, 3 things simultaneously. 1, Grantham was about to come through that door, have no idea anything had changed, and allow Patterson to escort him to a reception that he was attending as a private citizen, without knowing he was a private citizen. 2, I could not tell Patterson. I did not have the authority, the seniority, the clearance, or frankly the courage to walk up to a royal guard outside a minister's office and say, "Slight administrative issue." 3, the shepherd's pie was definitely gone. I stood by the water cooler at the end of the corridor, and I waited. The door opened at 2:54. Gerald Grantham was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been athletic, and had negotiated a comfortable truce with that fact, with white hair swept back from a broad forehead, and the specific confidence of someone who had spent the better part of 3 decades being important. He came through the door the way he always came through doors, which is to say as though the door had been waiting for him specifically, and was grateful for the opportunity. He saw Patterson and his chin went up half an inch. Not arrogance exactly, more like a man putting on a familiar coat. "Patterson," he said. I did not know, and still do not know, whether Grantham actually knew Patterson's name or whether he had simply been told it before the assignment. It does not matter. The effect was the same. Patterson's eyes moved, not his head, just his eyes to Grantham, and he gave a single precise nod. "Secretary of State," he said. 2 words, absolutely correct, spoken in the tone of a man reporting that a door is secure. And they walked. I should explain that when a royal guard escorts a minister through Whitehall, it is not like walking with a friend. There is a geometry to it. Patterson was 1/2 step behind Grantham's right shoulder, not beside him, not trailing him. One specific 1/2 step, maintained with the consistency of a man who has a ruler built into his nervous system. When Grantham's pace varied, and Grantham was a man who stopped to acknowledge people, who paused to issue instructions, who once reportedly delayed a motorcade for 4 minutes because he wanted to compliment a cleaner on the floor polish. Patterson's pace varied with him, the distance never changing, the geometry never breaking. I followed them. At a distance, I told myself I was heading downstairs anyway. I told myself this was my route. I told myself a number of things that were not exactly lies and not exactly true. The first stop was the 3rd floor assistant pool. Grantham paused at the desk of a young woman named Priya, who handled his correspondence and who had, I would later learn, already been reassigned to the new minister's team as of 2:38 that afternoon. "Priya," Grantham said, "I need you to pull the Lancaster House briefing notes and have them sent to my phone before we arrive." Priya looked at Grantham. Then she looked, very briefly, at Patterson. Patterson was looking at the middle distance, which is somewhere between the wall and eternity, and which royal guards have apparently located and can access at will. "Of course, Secretary of State," Priya said. She said it perfectly, not a tremor, not a flicker. I have thought about Priya many times since. She made a split-second calculation, correct, humane, and entirely in defiance of what her inbox had told her 40 minutes ago, and she made it without hesitation. She sent the briefing notes. I was beginning to understand that I was not the only one in the building, making quiet decisions about how to handle the next hour. Patterson escorted Grantham past the policy team, past the communications office, past a cluster of junior advisors who did what the British do when confronted with a situation they cannot address. They became extremely interested in their screens. One of them, a young man I did not know, newer than me, which I had not thought possible, actually stood up as Grantham passed, from some reflex of respect or panic, and sat down again before Grantham had fully registered him. Patterson did not react. Patterson did not react to anything. Patterson was, as far as anyone could see, escorting the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport through Whitehall on a Thursday afternoon, because that was his assignment, and his assignment was what was real. On the second-floor landing, a senior aide named Marcus Webb tried to intercept them. I say tried because intercept is not quite the right word. What Marcus Webb attempted was a kind of controlled gravitational drift, the move of a man who wants to stop something without appearing to stop anything, who has calculated that if he positions himself at a particular point on the landing and makes eye contact with the right person will understand, and the thing will be stopped. The right person in this calculation was Patterson. Marcus Webb had miscalculated. Patterson's eyes moved to Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb opened his mouth. Patterson's gaze did not change. It was not hostile. It was not dismissive. It was simply the gaze of a man who had been given an assignment and for whom an assignment was a complete and sufficient account of reality. Marcus Webb closed his mouth. Patterson continued walking. Grantham, who had not noticed any of this because he was checking his phone, continued beside him. Marcus Webb looked at me. I looked at Marcus Webb. We shared a moment of complete understanding and absolute helplessness, in the way that only two junior people can when they are watching something happen that neither of them has the authority to stop. I mouthed, "I know." He mouthed back something that I will not reproduce here, but which accurately summarized the situation. We went downstairs. The ministerial car was waiting at the Whitehall entrance. A Jaguar dark blue, the kind of car that exists to communicate consequence. The driver, a man named Tony who had been driving ministers for 11 years and had the specific emotional detachment of someone who has heard too many phone calls from the back seat to be surprised by anything, was standing by the rear door. Tony saw Grantham. Tony saw Patterson. Tony's face did the thing that faces do in Whitehall when they are processing information and have decided, in the absence of any official guidance, to simply drive. Patterson opened the rear door. Not Tony, Patterson. One smooth movement, his body angled precisely. The door held at the correct angle, not too wide, not too narrow, his eyes forward. His face the face of a man who has never in his life entertained the concept of this being unusual. "Thank you, Patterson," Grantham said and got in. Patterson closed the door, walked to his position, got in. The car pulled away. I stood on the pavement in November and watched the Jaguar indicate and merge into Whitehall traffic, and I thought, someone should really do something about this. I thought about who that someone should be. It was not me. It was not Marcus Webb, who was standing 6 feet to my left and appeared to have come to the same conclusion. It was not Priya, who was already answering emails for a different minister. It was, presumably, someone on the 4th floor who had a 4 o'clock appointment in their calendar and was not yet aware that the situation had developed a velocity of its own. Marcus Webb said, "Should we?" "No," I said. "But..." "No," I said again. He considered this. "Right," he said. We went inside. I did not get the shepherd's pie. I sat at my desk and I thought about Patterson in the back of that Jaguar, one half step behind a man who did not know, going to a room full of people who did. Lancaster House is a building that takes its responsibilities seriously. Cream and gold interiors. Ceilings that require a moment of adjustment when you first enter because they are taller than ceilings have any practical need to be, and they make you feel, whatever your station, that the station is lower than you thought. It hosts foreign dignitaries. It hosts state occasions. It hosts, on this particular Thursday afternoon, a cultural funding reception that had been planned for 6 weeks and had on its guest list approximately 80 people from the arts, media, and public funding sectors, all of whom had been told that the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport would be in attendance. The new Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport was also in attendance. This had not been planned. What had happened, and I got this account later from someone who was there, whose name I will protect because they still work in the building, is that the new minister, freshly briefed, freshly appointed, running on adrenaline and the particular terror of sudden elevation, had been advised to attend the reception as his first public act in the role. It would look confident. It would send a message. It would establish continuity. Nobody had thought to check who else was on the guest list. Or rather, somebody had thought to check and had sent an email, and the email had gone to a distribution list that no longer included the person who needed to receive it, because that person had been reassigned 40 minutes ago. The result was that at 3:47, in the entrance hall of Lancaster House, the Jaguar carrying Gerald Grantham and Patterson arrived, and Patterson got out first and opened the door, and Grantham stepped out into the cold November air with his chin at the correct angle, and Patterson fell into step 1/2 step behind his right shoulder, and they walked into Lancaster House together. I know what the room did when Grantham walked in, because the person who told me was standing near the entrance and had a clear view. The room did not gasp. The British do not gasp as a rule. What the room did was something more precise and more devastating. It went through a rapid, silent renegotiation. Conversations that had been mid-sentence arrived at their conclusion slightly faster than they had intended to. People who had been moving toward Grantham to greet him found that their trajectories adjusted slightly, by 2 or 3 degrees, in the way that iron filings adjust when a second magnet enters the field. The new minister was in the far corner. He had been told, I assume he had been told, I cannot confirm this. Nobody I have spoken to can confirm this. He had been told that Grantham would not be present. He was standing with a glass of sparkling water, talking to the director of a regional arts council, and he looked up when Grantham entered, and his face did the thing that faces do when the body understands something before the mind has caught up. Grantham had not yet seen him. Grantham was doing what Grantham did at receptions, which is to say he was moving through the room the way a warm front moves, gradual, encompassing, leaving everything slightly different in his wake. He shook hands. He remembered names. He asked after a theater company's new production with the specific enthusiasm of a man who has been briefed on theater companies and has chosen to treat the briefing as genuine interest, which is either a skill or a character trait and possibly both. Patterson was 1/2 step behind him. Patterson's face was the face of a man standing post. There is a particular art to standing post in a room full of people who are experiencing a collective social emergency. The art is, in its entirety, this: you do not participate in the emergency. You are not ignoring it. Ignoring implies awareness. Patterson was doing something more complete than ignoring. He was simply located in a different layer of reality, a layer in which his assignment was current. His minister was the minister, and the correct distance was 1/2 step behind the right shoulder, maintained. The room could not decide where to look. They looked at Grantham, who did not know. They looked at the new minister, who did know, and who was handling it with the controlled stillness of a man who has been in government long enough to know that the worst thing you can do in an unexpected situation is move. They looked at Patterson, who was the only person in the room behaving correctly, which made him, paradoxically, the most alarming person in the room. It was a woman named Helen, the head of a media literacy charity, someone who knew Grantham socially, who had been to his house for dinner, who had his wife's mobile number. It was Helen who crossed the room to him, touched his arm, leaned in, and said the thing. "I was not there for this. I am constructing this from accounts, but every account agrees on the following." She said it quietly. She said it with the particular gentleness of someone delivering information they wish they did not have. Grantham listened. He did not move while she was talking. He held very still. Then she finished, and he nodded once slowly, and she stepped back, and Grantham stood for a moment in the middle of the room, and the room held its breath in the way that rooms do when they have collectively decided that the most respectful thing they can offer is the pretense of not watching. And then Grantham straightened his jacket. It was a small gesture, both hands going to the lapels, a slight downward pull, the jacket settling back into its correct position. The gesture of a man restoring order to what he can reach. He turned. Patterson was one half step behind his right shoulder, exactly where he had been, exactly the distance he had maintained since the third-floor corridor. His eyes were forward. His face was the face of a man standing post. Grantham looked at him. Patterson looked at Grantham. What passed between them in that moment was not a conversation. It did not have words, and it did not need them. Grantham was 61 years old, and he had spent 30 years in rooms like this, and he had enough experience of the world to know, in that single exchange of eye contact, what the question was. The question was, did you know? Patterson held his gaze. Then he gave a single nod, 1 millimeter, regulation depth, the nod of a man completing an assignment. Grantham held Patterson's gaze for a moment longer. Then something crossed his face, not grief, not anger, something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. Something that a person needs to be 61 years old and to have spent 30 years in these rooms to produce. And then it was gone. And Gerald Grantham looked away and straightened his jacket one more time and walked toward the new minister with his hand already extended, his face composed, his chin at its customary angle. Patterson watched him go. Then Patterson turned, walked to the position by the door that was his correct post position, and stood there. His face said nothing. It had never said anything. I was not in the room. I was in a pub around the corner called the Silver Cross, sitting with Marcus Webb, drinking a pint I had not wanted but had ordered because Marcus Webb had looked at me on the pavement outside Whitehall and said pub in the tone of a man who has made a medical assessment. We were not talking. We were doing the thing that British people do when they are processing something they are not sure they are allowed to discuss, which is to stare at our pints and arrive, gradually, at the ability to speak. Marcus Webb spoke first. "How do you think he's getting home?" he said. I thought about it. "Presumably Tony's still waiting with the car," I said. Marcus Webb nodded slowly. "So Patterson will." "I expect so," I said. "We thought about this." "Right," Marcus Webb said. "We drank." The thing about working in Whitehall, the thing they do not tell you when you are 26 and impressed by red carpets and shepherd's pie on Thursdays, is that the machinery of government is operated by people, and people are imprecise, and the imprecision is not a flaw in the system. The imprecision is, in many ways, the system. Forms get filed late. Emails miss their recipients. Decisions made in fourth-floor rooms travel at their own pace through the building, and while they travel, life continues in the shape it had before the decision, because the alternative, stopping everything while the information catches up, is not practical and is not particularly humane. Grantham had not known because nobody had told him, and nobody had told him because the conversation was at 4 o'clock, and it was not yet 4 o'clock, and that is the whole administrative explanation. But Patterson, I had not been able to stop thinking about since the corridor. I said to Marcus Webb, "Do you think he knew?" Marcus Webb turned his pint glass slowly on the mat. "Has to have known," he said. These things don't stay quiet. But his assignment said Secretary of State, Marcus Webb said. Grantham was Secretary of State when they cut the assignment. Technically, he paused. Technically, he still was when they walked in. Technically, I said. Technically, Marcus Webb agreed. We thought about technically. Even if he knew, I said, his job was to escort the Secretary of State. Right. And Grantham was the Secretary of State. Technically. So he just did his job, Marcus Webb said. I drank. The pub was filling up with the Thursday after-work crowd, people from the offices along Whitehall, people who had had normal Thursdays and whose faces showed it, people who were talking too loudly about things that did not matter, which is what you do when you have had a normal Thursday and you deserve one. I said, it was kind though, wasn't it? Marcus Webb looked at me. What was? Seeing it through, I said. If he knew, seeing it through anyway. Grantham got to walk in as the minister, one last time. Patterson made sure of that. Marcus Webb thought about this for a long time. Long enough that someone fed the jukebox behind us, and an old song came on that neither of us knew well enough to name, but both of us had heard before. Patterson didn't make sure of anything, Marcus Webb said finally. Patterson did his assignment. Right, I said. Those might be the same thing, Marcus Webb said. In this case. Yeah, I said. We finished our pints. We went home. I missed my Thursday shepherd's pie and the Northern Line was delayed, and I stood on the platform at Westminster Station, thinking about a nod that was 1 millimeter deep in regulation, and had somehow contained everything that needed to be said. That was in November. I am telling you this now, which means a number of years have passed, and in those years I have changed departments twice, been promoted 3 times, attended more receptions at Lancaster House than I can count, and developed a professional relationship with red carpets that is considerably more complicated than the one I started with. Grantham left public life. He does some board work. He's been on radio for a few times. He sounds well. I asked about Patterson once, through channels, in the way that you ask about people in this world when you don't know them well enough to ask directly. I was told he had transferred to a different posting, something ceremonial, something that suited someone of his experience and particular qualities. That was enough. I did not need more than that. But the question Marcus Webb had asked, did he know? That one I could not let go. It sat with me the way a thing sits with you when you are not sure you have understood it properly, when you feel that the explanation you have settled on is close but not quite right, like a picture that is almost level but not quite, and you cannot unsee the gap. It was at a retirement party, not Marcus Webb's, someone else's, a woman from the old department whose name does not matter. It was at this retirement party, 2 years later, in a function room above a pub in Victoria, that I finally got my answer. Because Patterson was there. Not in uniform. In a dark suit, with a glass of orange juice, standing near the window with the specific comfort of a man who is used to standing near things. He was there because he had apparently worked with the retiree in some capacity I had not known about, which is the kind of thing you discover at retirement parties. The full shape of a person's working life, the connections you hadn't seen. I waited until he was alone, then I crossed the room. I don't know if you remember me, I said. Holloway, DCMS a few years ago. He looked at me. I remember, he said. I did not know entirely what I had expected his voice to sound like in a social context. It was the same voice. Of course it was. It just had less room around it. I was there, I said, that Thursday with Grantham. He nodded, 1 millimeter, different context, same depth. I've always wondered, I said. And then I stopped, because I wasn't sure how to ask it without it sounding like an accusation or an intrusion or something else it wasn't meant to be. He waited. He was very good at waiting. Did you know, I said, before you walked in, Did you know he'd been replaced?" Patterson looked at his orange juice. Then he looked at me. His face had exactly the expression it always had, which was the expression of a man for whom the situation is clear. "My assignment," he said, "was to escort the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport from his office to the reception at Lancaster House." "Right," I said. "I escorted the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport from his office to the reception at Lancaster House." "Right," I said again. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Is there another question?" I thought about it. "No," I said, "I don't think there is." He nodded, raised his orange juice slightly, not quite a toast, not quite not a toast, and turned back toward the window. I stood there for a moment, in the function room above the pub in Victoria, with the noise of the party behind me and the November dark through the window ahead of me. And I thought about a man who had been given an assignment and had done it, and about what it means to do a thing correctly when you know, or do not know, or have decided that knowing and not knowing are not the point. When you know that the doing of it correctly is the last decent thing available. I thought about Grantham's hands on his lapels. I thought about 1mm. I thought about how the kindest thing sometimes, the only genuinely kind thing, is to treat someone as what they were, for exactly as long as the assignment holds, without acknowledgement, without drama, without making them feel the change before they are ready. I thought about how Patterson had done this not as an act of compassion but as an act of duty, and how those two things had turned out, on a Thursday afternoon in November, to be identical. I went back to the party. I got a drink. Someone made a speech about the retiree that was too long and quite funny and mostly true, and people laughed in the right places, and the evening did what evenings do. I have told this story 47 times, 48 counting Keith. Every time people ask the same question, did he know? Every time I give them Patterson's answer. And every time, without fail, the room goes quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when they have heard something that is not quite an answer and is not quite not an answer. And when the silence finishes, they look at me and they say some version of, yeah, that's right. That's the whole thing right there. That's it.